What do Elvis Presley, Amelia Earhart, Babe Ruth, and Winchester all have in common? Well, you're going to go back to 1935 to find out. Hi everyone, Ron Spomer here with one of my favorite little cartridges. The 220 Swift is obviously a 22. It is a centerfire cartridge, and when it came out, it was pushing a 48 grain bullet, 4,140 feet per second. Unheard of for the time. Think about it, 1935? What the heck was going on then? It was the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 29 had everybody broke. The Dust Bowl was going on. There was an 8-year drought in the middle of the 30s. It was the dirty 30s. Nobody had any money. The Okies were going to California. Think John Steinbeck and the Grapes of Wrath. The country was in the doldrums. The president had to start relief programs. They started Social Security in 1935 and the WPA programs, the public work programs. I remember the CCC programs, Civilian Conservation Corps. Just the generation before I came along, they were building all of the little lakes in the country I lived in where we could go fishing. So there were some good things that came out of it, but man, there were bread lines and people were starving. And yet Winchester comes up with a new hot rod cartridge? Sounds weird to me, but this is what happened. So if you can think back to those days and imagine what was around, well, the 30-06 had been around for quite a while now. In 1906, there was the 253,000 Savage cartridge, fairly small caliber that was going pretty fast. That set the 3,000 foot per second mark. But now we've broken 4,000, and just 3 years prior to that, Winchester came out with the 22 Hornet, and that was considered to be a hot little number for varminting. The 220 Swift added 1,400 feet per second more velocity to that one. So it wasn't an evolution, it was a revolution. Winchester chambered that in their Model 54 bolt-action rifle, but the very next year, in 1936, they were chambering it at the then brand new rifleman's rifle, the Model 70. And bingo, it was hot stuff, but it soon got in trouble. Barrel burning. Almost everyone who's heard of the 220 Swift thinks of it as a barrel burner, yet it's hung around to this day. Think about that. We're getting on the edge of 100 years here. 35, now we're at 25. Give it 10 more years and the 220 Swift is going to be an old timer. It's an antique, and yet it's still one of the fastest cartridges in the world. So I don't know. Winchester just had one heck of an idea. Where did they get it from? At the time, there was a famous wildcatter named Grosvenor Watkin, and he was making the 220 Swift neck down to 22 go really fast. And that's what gave Winchester the idea. But instead of using that 250 Savage cartridge, they went with the 6mm Lee Navy. This was an obscure cartridge that really our Marines were using for a few years in a straight pull action rifle. But Winchester was making it for civilian market, and they were loading the ammo, and the sales weren't going all that great. So the theory is that they said, we've got all this brass, we've got all this Lee Navy ammunition stuff, let's neck it down to 22 and make this one. And that's what they did, apparently. But the crazy thing was they put a bit of a rim on it. The 220 Swift is known as a semi-rimmed cartridge. So they've got some rim on which to grab with the extractor hook, but what the hey, there's plenty of cartridges in the Model 54 and the Model 70 that would grab a cartridge without a rim. Why would they go to that? Well, they wanted the diameter of the rim to be the same as the 30-06 class of cartridges, 0.473 inches. And that's what you get. Then they stepped down to the body diameter of about 0.45, and then they tapered it down to about 0.402 at the shoulder. So there's a fair amount of taper in this case. Nevertheless, it has significant powder capacity, and it can drive bullets really, really fast. So when it came out, it was obviously turning some heads, and the people who used it for shooting quickly burned their barrels out. Some say, well, it was the steels of the day that weren't all that high quality, but mostly it was rapid fire. If you got onto an infestation of rodents and you started shooting quickly, and you didn't control yourself, you could heat that barrel up so hot that it would easily erode at the throat with all that flame temperature coming out. This is kind of the standard thing with cartridges. If you've got a lot of powder and a narrow bore and you're shoving a hot powder down there, you're going to be eroding the throat, and there goes your accuracy. So some people would report as few as 400 rounds before their accuracy started to drop. Others, though, would say if you shoot judiciously and you don't shoot too quickly, they were getting 4,000 rounds out of the 220 Swift, which is kind of an eye-opener. I kind of agree with that latter number, especially these days with our better quality steel barrels and such. I think if you use this, let's say for a coyote hunting rifle, or you take your time when you're picking off your varmints off the field out there and not shoot it too hot, you're going to get plenty of barrel life out of it, and you're going to have one of the flattest shooting 22s ever built. Now, it is said that the 223 Winchester Super Short Magnum goes a little bit faster, and it does, but where are you going to find one of those these days? Not all that popular and all that common. Well, the 220 Swift isn't all that common anymore either. The rifles that were chambered for it were, of course, the 54 Winchester, the Model 70 Winchester, Savage 110, the 110 Savage bolt actions were chambered for it, Ruger 77 bolt action, the Ruger #1 single shot, and then a lot of custom manufacturers like Dakota Arms and just about anybody you can think of. If you want a 220 Swift in a custom rifle, just order it and they'll probably build it for you. And it'll fit a standard short action. The cartridge itself is actually a little bit shorter than, say, your 308, which is your short action. 2.8 inches. This one is 2.6. So you can even seat your bullets out a little far if they've throated it properly. And that suggests you could shoot some longer bullets, some of those long, sleek, high BC bullets of this day. But you've got to remember that back in 1935 and throughout the 20th century, standard rifling twists for the 220 Swift were 1 in 14. A few manufacturers made them 1 in 12, but that's not fast enough to stabilize today's really long, heavy bullets. That would be more efficient at longer ranges, especially with your wind deflection. So if you want to mess around with the 220 Swift these days and really milk its performance, you're first of all going to have to use hand loads, not factory ammo, and then you're going to have to get a faster twist barrel to stabilize the best bullets. But we're going to look at some numbers and see what you can do with the older systems as well as the upgraded ones. So first of all, remember that the 220 Swift is no longer chambered for any commercial rifles that I know of. Maybe you guys do. Let me know. But they've pretty much dropped it unless there's a special edition. I remember in 1992, Remington came out with their limited edition classic Model 700 bolt action rifle in the 220 Swift. Prior to that, or maybe it was a little after that, they were offering their varmint rifles, the heavy stock, heavy barrel rifles in 220 Swift. But I think that's the only time they loaded them. These days, occasionally Ruger might come out with one as a special edition, especially through Lipsky's or something like that. But in general, you're just not going to find them chambered. But if you've got one from Grandpa or Dad or somebody and you want to get out and work with it, factory ammunition, you're going to probably find 50 grain bullets and 55, and that is about it. They used to load them with 40s and 48s and 45s and even up to 60, but not anymore. And they have also throttled back. And that was part of the response to you're burning out your barrels too much. They throttled them back and pushed them to about 22, 250 Remington velocities, and that seemed to settle that down for a lot of people, or at least they imagine it had. Now, what I think the 220 Swift is viable for these days, in addition to a great long-range coyote rifle, is a pronghorn, whitetail, mule deer rifle. Oh my gosh. Don't shoot the messenger. How could I say such a thing? I mean, it's not even legal in some states. Well, people have long argued about this, and one of the more famous ones who was a big supporter of the 220 Swift was P.O. Ackley, the famous gunsmith, who made the Ackley improved cartridges. And he had some great things to say about the 220 Swift. He had found that it was a darned effective big game cartridge. And he got some of that information from a gentleman who was a ranger at Grand Canyon National Park charged with culling feral burros that were wreaking havoc on the environment. He was shooting burros up to 600 pounds in weight with 30-06s, 8x57 Mausers, and a 220 Swift in the late 1930s, and he found that the surest killer was the 220 Swift. Another old timer was a trapper up in Alaska, Frank Glazer, known as Wolfman, and he was investigating different cartridges quite a bit. He was trapping furs, living in log cabins out in the wilderness, living off the land, and he found that the 220 Swift, of all the rifles that he tested, was the most effective killer of caribou, moose, Dall sheep, everything he shot except for grizzly bears. They found out it didn't work so well on grizzlies. But what these guys were doing, I am pretty sure, was picking their shots. Take a broadside shot behind the shoulder, the old killing shot that we always use, tight behind the shoulder, put that bullet into the lungs and the heart, and you know what varmint bullets do once they get inside of something. They erupt rather violently and make that softball to grapefruit-sized damage that just takes out the heart and lungs, and you get some pretty quick demise. So I think that's why those guys were so enamored of it. Now, Ackley seemed to think that it should be used for deer hunting, and he had some pointed things to say about it, especially with the legislators who were saying you cannot use it legally for deer hunting. In mentioning that it was the hot rod cartridge and the fastest ever and all the rest of it, he says it has proven to be extremely deadly on deer in spite of what some authorities want to think and would like to have their readers think. Of course, the 220 Swift will produce outstanding failures on big game, just as the larger calibers do. And critics of high velocity have been quick to pounce on such failures and publicize them. The same authorities have the same types of failures with larger cartridges, but they're always able to produce an alibi for the bigger ones. If 100 head of deer could be killed under average conditions with the 220 Swift and another 100 with the 30-06 under the same average conditions, it is quite likely that the Swift would come off the winner. Many states have legislated against the Swift and similar cartridges for use on deer and larger game. It is very doubtful that very many of the legislators making these regulations have ever hunted with a Swift. Doubtless most of them belong to the 30-30 fraternity. So Ackley was pointing out quite a bit of bias, which was common in those days, and I think is probably just as viable now. Although a lot of states now have allowed 22 center fires for deer hunting because they have just found out that so many people have been so effective with them, and there's such little recoil that they can shoot accurately, and that is always the key to being an effective deer hunter and shooter and an effective deer cartridge. It's putting that right bullet in the right place. So, what is the right bullet for the 220 Swift these days? Well, that 48 grain has been long gone, but kind of the standards, 50 grain and 55 grain. You can find a few at 60 grains, but you're probably going to have to hand load. Fortunately, we have got some great options these days for hand loaders, and we want to cover the 50 grain, the 55 grain, and a 68 grain copper bullet. Whoa. We're going to have some problems with twist rate. 1 in 14 twist, you can stabilize most 50 grain bullets. I can drive that one probably, according to the hand loading manuals, 3,988 feet per second. That will give me 1,766 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. Get out to 100 yards and the energy is down to 1365. Get out to 300 yards and your energy is below the 1,000, often recommended for deer. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference here in this case if, again, you put that right bullet in the right place. But 801 foot-pounds of energy at 300 yards. Most of us are looking at that 220 Swift for flat trajectories, and you're going to get that. If I zero this to be no higher than 2 inches at mid-trajectory, that'd be about 150 yards. It'll be 1.5 inches high at 100. It'll be only a 1/2 inch low at 250 yards. It won't even be 2 inches low at 300. That means you can pick off pretty tiny rodents out to 300 yards with a dead-on hold. Foxes, coyotes, no problem. And if you want to reach a little further, 350 yards, you're only dropping 5 inches. Hold on the back line and drop it in. The wind deflection, though, is the big concern with these relatively short bullets with low BCs. And yes, at 300 yards and a 10-mile-an-hour right angle wind, you've got 8.9 inches of wind deflection already. That's about as much as you want to try to guesstimate. But if you want to stretch out to 400 yards, you're 16.78, almost 17 inches of wind deflection. So there's the downside of those light, fast bullets. Yeah, they're pretty darn flat, but the wind is probably going to get you out west, where your longer shots come into play at any rate. So step up to a 55 grain bullet, and we can drive that one probably 3,850 feet per second. We'll put the chart up here. You can look at the numbers. As you can see, your energy, again, you're looking at about 1,000 foot-pounds of energy at 250 yards, after which it drops and drops. 400 yards, 682 foot-pounds. You don't want a long-range shot on these deer and pronghorn and such. Wind deflections, a little less, 15 and a half inches at 400 yards. So I think you're looking at an effective deer cartridge in a 220 Swift with a 55 grain bullet at probably 300 yards. You might want to argue with me, but that just seems a sensible selection. So why don't we get a heavier bullet? Well, it's because of those twist rates. In order to stabilize the longer, heavier bullets, you've got to have a faster twist. So if you're going to make a 220 Swift, get a barrel, chamber it. I would throat it long for these longer bullets, and then see what you can do. Now, one of them that I think would be really fun to work with for big game hunting would be a 68 grain Hammer HHT. And that thing I can drive at probably 3,380 feet per second. That will give me 1,725 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle, and I'm going to carry 1,000 clear out to 300 yards. So you've got some more energy working for you. The BC on that bullet is fairly high. I used a ballistics coefficient of 0.184, but that's the G7, not the G1. If you're not familiar with the differences on those, you better look them up, because the G7 numbers are more accurate for modern sleek boat tail bullets, but it's a lower number than what you're probably used to. I would guess that you'd be up there closer to 0.250 with a G1 equivalent. At any rate, that bullet, if it's zeroed again for that 2 inches high at about 150 yards, you're only 3¼ inches low at 300 yards, 13 inches low at 400. And your wind deflection has improved quite a bit. You've got 6.51 of wind deflection at 300 yards and 12 inches roughly at 400 yards. So I think you've got the energy in that bullet, and particularly you have the bullet that's going to expand and retain a long shank for deeper penetration. Now, these hammer bullets will break off their petals. They're designed to break off and disperse, much like a frangible varmint bullet, but without the lead, and then the shank keeps penetrating. And I have had great luck with those in a variety of calibers from 25 up to 45, so you might want to think about trying something like that. Bottom line on the 220 Swift is it's a great cartridge to own if you just enjoy having a touchstone to the good old days. It's a heck of a inventive cartridge from an era in which you would not expect that kind of performance. It really sort of blows it away. These days, I think it is overdone by the 22 Creedmoor. I hate to say anything about don't get a 220 Swift if you're all excited about it, but honestly, the 22 Creedmoor these days does the same thing with a more efficient modern cartridge in a fast twist barrel with the long, heavy bullets, and you just have a lot easier time of doing it. But if you like to hot rod, play around with your cartridges and build up your own rifles and have something different, the 220 Swift is still viable in the 21st century. So you might want to give it a try. That is the story on one of the early, fast, and still with us 22 centerfire cartridges, the famous 220 Swift. If you get one, if you have one, and if you hunt with one, do hunt honest and shoot straight. And I forgot. Okay, here we go.